The Trump administration's talk and actions on a border wall, trade, and immigration enforcement has New Mexico lawmakers and others reacting. Plus, we have other legislative issues facing the state to discuss on this episode of New Mexico Now. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno. Joining us in studio is editorial page editor with the Las Cruces Sun-News, Walt Rubel. Also with us is president of the Border Industrial Association and executive director of the International Business Accelerator. And he also writes the column Business Across the Border for the Albuquerque Journal, Jerry Pacheco. And also joining us in studio is editor and publisher of nmpolitics.net, Heath Hauseman. Thank you all for joining us. Well, let's get things started. President Trump has made it clear his executive actions, like building a border wall and strengthening border security, along with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement raids reported across the country, they've sparked reaction protests. Recently, we saw in Las Cruces, immigration advocates protested against a reported ICE raid that happened just over a week ago. And that protest actually shut down Main Street during the evening rush hour for some time before a peaceful resolution was found. It doesn't stop there. In the last week, the Associated Press reported on the Trump administration discussing the possibility of deploying National Guard soldiers across the country to help with border security and enforcement. The Trump administration has denied that, and Homeland Security has also been quoted as saying that the plan wasn't seriously considered. However, we do know that there was a memo regarding that within the Department of Homeland Security. And also, yesterday, Homeland Security announced it was stepping up its efforts on getting tough on immigration enforcement, which could expand the numbers of those being deported. Yesterday, as of the day we're taping this program. First, as we know, President Trump campaigned on getting tough on border security and immigration. And a constant theme throughout the campaign was build the wall. We heard the chants throughout the campaign that people were chanting that. New Mexico lawmakers at the federal level, state, and even local level have weighed in on building a wall, border security, and enforcement. In fact, just this last week, Las Cruces city councilors even passed a resolution voting opposition against a border wall that the president wants. A measure to block building a wall on New Mexico state land has also passed out of a state House committee, with co-sponsor and Democratic Representative Bill McCamley from Mesilla Park speaking out against a wall, saying it would hurt New Mexico's efforts to build trade. Also well known is, of course, President Trump's feelings about NAFTA, calling it a, quote, disaster. We know that as well. So I'd like to start off, Jerry, you work on the border. Is a wall a hinder to the 21st century economy from what you see on the border?
We already have a wall between Santa Teresa and San Jeronimo, our counterpart on the other side of the border. That wall stretches all the way from El Paso, and it ends just to the west of the Santa Teresa port of entry. So there's a wall there. A wall's not going to physically deter our trade. We still have those relationships. What we're worried about as an association and me personally as a business person is the message it sends to Mexico that we don't value that relationship. That's a horrible thing to say. We want to foment relationships, and there's been no other state in the United States that has benefited more from NAFTA than New Mexico. If you go back to 1999, our trade with Mexico was up 3,000 to 271%. We're number one in the United States. With all this momentum that we've had and all the businesses we're bringing in, and we're about to overtake Albuquerque, by the way, as the state's major industrial base. I expect to see that in June. Here we are going to put up a wall and send a signal to our partners in Mexico, not only in the private sector, but in the public sector, that we don't value the relationship and we look at you as a threat. I think sends the wrong signal.
Now, you know, with the wall, I mean, there's also the trade. I mean, how does this talk affect possible options with trade with Mexico and future economic development along the border?
What it's done to us, and the question I get asked most is, how's it affecting you guys on the border? I mean, we've got an industrial base that's inching up to $2 billion worth of exports out of Santa Teresa. It's huge. We're accounting for almost half of the state's entire export base here. the whole talk about the wall, immigration, the uncertainty, and I think the uncertainty is what's causing most of the problems. Most of our members say, hey, we can compete as long as we know what the rules are. If you're going to change the rules, we need to know what they are. The longer you drag out the uncertainty, the greater it impacts us. And so when I'm asked, has it affected you guys? 100% yes. We have several deals that have been put on ice that we would have already recruited into the Santa Teresa area, and I calculate about 100 jobs and about $35 million worth of investment that has been put on ice because of the uncertainty. In other words, the companies don't want to come, build a building or occupy a building until they have a sense of what Washington wants to do. We also have several companies locally that are already there that had plans to expand their operations and add more employees that are not going to do it until they figure this out.
Now, one of the other things that we've seen from the president is he's not afraid to go after his opponents on Twitter or people who disagree with him. We've seen just Ford Motor Company recently cancel an over $1 billion plan in Mexico. So obviously companies are reacting in certain ways to how the president targets his social media activity. So, are we in a world now where future investors and business people along the border are checking Twitter on a daily basis?
Well, yeah, we live in that world. We have several members that have 90% of what they produce in our industrial base exported to Mexico. And they are, in private, they'll tell you this is really hurting us. It's destroying our ability to seek new contracts. It's really raised concern amongst our OEMs that we're selling to in Mexico, but don't quote me on anything. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to be the target of a tweet or a knock on the door. And I tell them I think that's kind of extreme because in general, you're kind of a smaller company, but the fear is there and they don't want that to reverberate in their industry or amongst their buyers. So that is a major concern.
And I think that carries over to Congress as well. They have that same fear. There are a lot of people who I think would like to speak out against some of these proposals, but they don't want to be on the wrong end of a tweet either. And so, I think that is a very powerful thing that we're all kind of still trying to figure out how to deal with.
Well, and it's my sense, and talking to some business owners, is the concerns are valid in some way. If the president is successful in pulling some of these manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest or places they've been lost from, the border loses. It's not just Mexico that loses jobs. It's in some ways the infrastructure we've built up on this side and the jobs we have on this side because we're right there. And I can remember times when Jerry and I would talk about the vision for an even more open industrial park area where people could move across the border and work in those jobs, and now, at least optically, we're moving in the opposite direction. The economy in New Mexico is going to be hurt if the president is successful.
Oh, one of the things that also was brought up, though, the stock market's doing well.
Yes.
So, is that something that seems like economists say, hey, markets are responding well right now to, lower taxes and possibly less regulation?
Well, they're responding to the prospect of lower taxes and less regulation. But none of those things have happened yet. And so, I think it's important to note that the market is going up, but it can just as quickly go down. It is going up on the expectation that things they hope will happen. But Congress still has a long ways to go. And on that tax hike, that I think this gets back to the border and what Jerry was talking about, all the uncertainty. This border adjustment tax that they are kicking around, which would essentially be a 20% tax on everything coming into the country. I think that is part of that uncertainty and part of where Congress really is struggling, and so that's why I say that the stock market is expecting that that's going to happen. But Lindsey Graham said just last week that they don't have 10 votes in the Senate because of that border adjustment tax that they're trying to put on in the House.
Well, it's a major issue for us because that's not yet come to pass. But the discussion over that, when you are vested in bricks and mortar, in terms of millions of dollars of an investment, for example, and I'm using the case of Santa Teresa, and you're responsible for 50 or 100 employees, it makes you think twice about adding to your plant. It makes you think twice about adding another 20 workers. we have a situation here where the Santa Teresa industrial base, which has been one of the bright spots in New Mexico's economy, I mean, given the petroleum issue and the cutback in government spending, we've had tremendous momentum. We are a supplier base to Mexico's industrial base, and we've been very successful in recruiting companies not only from the rest of the United States. And the ironic thing is that our president refers to all the jobs lost out of Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. A lot of those jobs have simply moved within the United States to the border. So if you look at our membership, it's very Midwest based. But most of our membership has a tie to Mexico, and most of our membership has a supply base that is not only the jobs in Santa Teresa, which we have about 4,200, it's 3 jobs upstream in the United States. In other words, it's the logistics company that's moving stuff from Chicago to the plant down here that gets transformed, that goes into Mexico. It's the private customs brokerage firms. It's all the quality inspection people that are third party. And so one of our companies, which is a major exporter, estimates that for every job they have in Santa Teresa, they've created, or 3 jobs in the United States are responsible for that job. So when you start talking about this uncertainty and tearing up the supply chain, which is not only integrated, it's synchronized, you affect jobs back in the United States. And I think that's what the rhetoric does not take into account.
One of the other things that was brought up is, how Mexico could respond in a certain way to this type of, tax. So what are some of the things that we could possibly see with Mexico in response?
It's interesting. One of my good friends called me up and who runs a plant and says, hey, this border adjustment tax might not be bad because I'm going to get a credit also on my exports and this and that, and my competitor in Mexico is going to be at disadvantage. And I said, well, buddy, you don't think Mexico is going to reciprocate exactly the same way, so you're exactly at zero. And a lot of economists think that in spite of that, if the value of the dollar goes up, it's a wash anyway. So, it's very simplistic to think you can tinker with something like that and wave a magic wand and everything is solved. It's much more complicated than that.
Speaking of complicated, I'd like to move on to immigration. Obviously, the Homeland Security this week came out with their response on how they're going to tackle immigration enforcement. In Las Cruces, we've seen a raid already that's been reported and the impact that has. When you have situations where there is some fear in the community about possibly families being broken up and people being deported, what does that send to what does that do to a community? I mean, we've already seen it last week. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let's be clear first about what has happened. It appears at this point that the number of people ICE has detained is not, at this point, significantly different than during the Obama administration. What's different is who they're detaining. During the Obama administration, it appeared that generally they'd have a warrant for somebody who was wanted for some kind of violent crime or some reason other than the fact that they lived in the United States illegally. They would find that person, they would deport them. What's happened, it sounds like in the last 2 weeks, is they go looking for that person, and if they don't find that person, but they find someone else who is deportable, somebody who's here without legal status but not wanted for a rape or a DWI or something else, they pick them up anyway. And so that's a shift from a certain type of immigrant living here without legal status to, and these orders we saw yesterday, the memo from Homeland Security makes clear that nearly every one of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country is now deportable. We're leaving DACA recipients alone for now.
We're
that
talking
could change.
over 700,000 people.
Yeah, so 10 million or so people. Obama, I think about 3 million people were deported while Obama was president. If we deport 10 million people in the next 4 years, that would have dramatic impacts on the economy, on other things. The Las Cruces Public Schools last week, the day after the ICE raid in Las Cruces, absenteeism, particularly in the elementary schools, soared. And I haven't checked this week, but I've wondered if it was going to continue. If that's a longer term thing, that affects school district funding if those kids stay out of school. My understanding is healthcare clinics have had people not showing up for appointments. I've heard from a couple of employers who say, I don't know because DACA, I can hire this person, but should I hire this person? Are they going to be deported?
But wondering, I'm curious from the person who is protected by DACA. I mean, the government has their information and knows who they are. So while I'm curious, this has to cause some anxiety for those.
Enormous anxiety, and I think a big part of the problem is we keep getting to this same word, uncertainty. When the raid happened last week, we got a bunch of phone calls at the newspaper, and we did what we always do. We called the federal authorities, and they would not confirm anything, which is standard procedure. That's not anything new under Trump, but it makes it very difficult for people who care about that community to get accurate information and to know what's going on. A couple of days later, the sheriff's office had a routine traffic patrol, and we must have gotten 20 calls saying ICE is doing when it was just a normal traffic patrol. And so I think that kind of misinformation and confusion probably serves the interests of I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it's certainly in our community, it's just having a devastating effect on so many people.
Yeah, it seems like we're going to continue to monitor this as it's changing day by day, but we have to move on. We have plenty of issues to talk about with the state legislature, which is in session now. As we're taping this program, just about 25 days left to figure out a budget. New Mexico state legislators are dealing with budget problems, and this week the New Mexico House Appropriations and Finance Committee approved a $6.1 billion package, and it was along party lines. Democrats with the majority pushed it through and said the bill would provide $32 million for public schools, which some say are caught up in this budget battle between the Democrats in the state legislature and Republican Governor Susana Martinez, who has vowed against tax raises. Democrats and Republicans are trying to craft their own arguments regarding this solution. I'd like to ask the panel, who has the best argument right now? Is this somebody winning the message war right now?
Just to be clear, the reason the governor and the Republicans opposed it is because it has a little over $200 million in tax increases. And the governor has made very clear that she will not support tax increases. The way those break down, to me, the most interesting one would be taxing internet sales. But they would also go after some of the medical sales. They would go after trucks, which is always a popular one because it doesn't hit the local people. Although Jerry,
Jerry could weigh in on that definitely. I mean, how that would impact.
Right, and then the other one is car sales, and so those are the things that in the House bill that they're trying to raise taxes in those areas. I don't know if the Senate supports any of that. I don't get the sense that there's a lot of coordination between the House and the Senate on this. So the House has taken their shot. The ball's in the Senate's court now. I don't know where it goes from here, but it's an interesting first shot, I think.
I do think there's going to be some wrangling back and forth between House Democrats and Senate Democrats. They'll come up with a bill that raises $200 million or so in taxes. It won't be what the House has passed. There'll be some back and forth there. The governor says no taxes. She's actually signed a couple of small tax increases in the law. In 2013, as part of a compromise, big tax bill, there was a combined reporting that increased some taxes on out-of-state corporations doing business here. So her rhetoric that she never supports tax increases is simply not true. She's done it, but she does it very selectively. My suspicion is we're going to see Democrats in the House and Senate come up with some kind of bill that's about $200 million in tax increases. It's going to go to the governor. I would guess she'll leave one or two of those tax increases intact. Maybe the internet sales, because local businesses seem to not oppose that it hurts them if you go into a store to look at something, figure out if you want to buy it, and then you go order it on Amazon because it's cheaper. So that's one that some Republicans and business owners can support, but then she's going to veto some of the others and we'll be left without a balanced budget at the end of the session.
I mean, we're looking at somewhat of a stalemate, and time's running out to actually get a budget. I mean, do we have a possibility of a special session to actually get something done?
I think we will have one this year. It may not be immediate. I think the Democrats have made clear they're not going to. There will not be cuts in this budget. The House and Senate Democrats seem united in that, and they have the votes to make that happen. The governor's made clear she's not going to sign $200 million in tax increases. Now, part of that $200 million is to increase our reserves so that our bond rating isn't downgraded again. So there's some wiggle room there to operate in the black, even if it's bad on Wall Street, to stay in the black here. So she can veto some things and keep us close to the line to not be spending in a deficit. But my assumption is we'll be somewhere below the line. We may float around for a few months before she calls us back into a special session in the middle of the year or the fall. Or it may be immediate if she's mad enough and vetoes the whole bill. I don't know.
Well, I would hope that the executive and legislative branches would come to some kind of compromise. I know it's very difficult, and they have a heck of a job to do. But from our standpoint, we work with both branches, by the way. But it's difficult when you're recruiting companies. You want to put your best foot forward, and you want to be attractive. And companies that are going to invest $20 million do their due diligence. And that includes everything from the local situation where they can actually locate a plant all the way to the federal level. And that includes the state. You know, how are we doing? How's the government going to support this? You guys pretty stable, this and that. So I hope we don't go into special session, but I hope they do come to some kind of compromise. The quicker the better, because that gives us an advantage to say, see, we're working together. New Mexico is a great place to locate a business, and I hope that comes into consideration in the negotiations.
If we are in this, another special session year, this would be a number of them that we've had recently. I mean, what does that send, to potential investors who may be interested in, relocating to the border?
We certainly get questions on that. It's been good and bad. I mean, on the positive side, during a special session in 2015, our border region, particularly in Santa Teresa, we got $8.3 million to upgrade our roads. So that was a benefit. But in the macro sense, it's probably not a good thing, because you want companies to look at your local government, and they want consistency. In the business world, you don't want the rules to change on you or to have instability at any level. I mean, we're talking instability or uncertainty at the federal level. We certainly don't want that at the state level. So we are rooting for both sides to come together at an 11th hour compromise. But it certainly is going to be an issue for companies that are doing the due diligence. We'll get questions on that.
Well, one of the things that has been discussed in the legislature has been tax reform. We've seen something of a start of that. Walt, I know you've written about this in recent columns. So what are we looking at as far as that goes?
Jason Harper has introduced a massive bill, more than 300 pages, that would essentially change what our gross receipts tax is now, which is very, it's different than a traditional sales tax that you have in most states. And so his bill would seek to make our tax more similar to the taxes in other states, and to also get rid of all of these loopholes and exemptions that have been passed over the years. The term that keeps coming up is Swiss cheese, that we keep plugging these holes in our tax code, and eventually you erode it to the point where you're not able to take care of your basic functions anymore. And so part of that bill is going to be to reinstate the tax on food, which I just think is going to be a non-starter for a lot of Democrats. It doesn't have the support of Voices for Children and a lot of the groups that I know a lot of Democrats listen to on these kinds of issues. I don't think it, and because of that, I don't think it's going very far this year, but it is a very ambitious start, I think, to something that people on both sides agreed needs to happen. That there needs to be a real comprehensive look at this tax code, and we do need to take a look at which of these incentives are working and which of them aren't, because we don't know right now. We've got all of these credits on the books that are costing us millions of dollars, and we don't know if we're getting anything out of them or not.
Well, that'll be interesting to see. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to fill that time with the question to you all is this the year that New Mexico could see an establishment of an independent ethics commission?
Can I start on that one? My guess right now is no. And I hate to say that because it happens. I've been covering this for 10 years. But last year we had a bill that finally had bipartisan support. Republicans started getting on board. It passed the House. Gets to the Senate Rules Committee, which is the graveyard for ethics reform in the New Mexico Legislature. Democrats in the Senate Rules Committee. Not every Democrat necessarily, but that committee. They were prepared to gut it. The Republican sponsor of the bill, Jim Dines from Albuquerque, withdrew it, said, I won't have you do this. I and others criticized them. Senator Daniel Ivey Soto from Albuquerque lashed out at the media, said, I just joined this committee, give us a year and we'll have a good bill. He dropped his bill this year, and it's horrible. It would gut the Inspection of Public Records Act. It would make it secret complaints of violations when you don't get public records secret. Campaign Reporting Act, elections violations right now are complaints are public record. It would make them secret. U.S. House Republicans got criticized when they tried to gut their ethics watchdog in Washington earlier this year. They withdrew it. Ivy Soto's bill would create a watchdog for New Mexico legislature that's weaker than what House Republicans wanted to do.
Yeah, we're running out of time though, real quick. So you want to weigh in on that, Walt?
Well, it's just very depressing. I've been covering this as long as Heath has, and we've seen this play out year after year, where at the start of the session, people get their hopes up. We have a new Senate Majority Leader this year. I really thought that would make a difference, but when you see what's happening, it's just discouraging.
I would encourage our state to put your best foot forward. We're now a part of the conversation for companies to relocate here. This is a good thing. It would be a good thing. Stability, putting forth good, understandable legislation is what we need to do, and that helps us recruit companies to New Mexico. So that would be my take on that.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to Walt Rubel, Jerry Pacheco, and Heath Hausman. Also, remember, you could always like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at PRWG for the latest news and programming announcements. And remember, we would love to hear your story, ideas, and topics for this program and others. You can always email those to feedback@nmsu.edu. I'm Anthony Moreno. Thank you for joining us for another episode of New Mexico Now.